waiting. None of us anticipated just how long the exchanges would be in the House of Commons following the Prime Minister's statement. You will appreciate that this day is very significant, not just here in Liverpool, but in the whole nation. And you'll understand too that for the families and the survivors, it's a traumatic time. They have received an overview of the report earlier this morning, and I should report to you that when they heard the overview at the end of it, they stood to applaud what they had received. But I'm mindful of the death of 96 people, and although it may not be usual practice, we on the panel feel that it would be appropriate to ask you with us to stand at the beginning of this press conference simply to remember them and the nature of what it is that is being recorded today. Please stand. Thank you. I'm going to ask my colleagues on the panel if they would introduce themselves to you and also tell you the particular expertise that they bring to the panel.
I'm Professor Phil Scraton, and I'm in the School of Law at Queen's University, and as some of you will know, I'm author of Hillsborough the Truth and worked on the Hillsborough project in its early days.
Dr. Bill Kirkup. I formerly worked in the Department of Health as Associate Chief Medical Officer, and I'm the medical member of the panel.
My name is Christine Gifford, and I'm a specialist in disclosure of information, and I led on disclosure for the panel.
My name is Katie Jones. I'm a television producer and journalist and was the factual producer on the Jimmy McGovern drama documentary.
My name is Peter Sissons. I used to work in news broadcasting. I've been of use to the panel, I hope, in advising on media matters.
And my name is Paul Lighton. I was the Deputy Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and I advised on policing matters.
My name is Sarah Tyek, and I was formerly the Keeper of Public Records for the United Kingdom Government, and I am the archivist on the panel.
I'm Raju Bhatt, the legal member on the panel, with 25 odd years experience in areas including deaths in custody.
Thank you. It's been a remarkable aspect of the panel's work that we've been served by people with expertise in so many important areas that are relevant to the panel's task. The 20th anniversary of the Hillsborough tragedy, over 30,000 people came to Anfield. It showed that there were questions still unresolved and that the wound of grief in this city was still open and very sore. When the Hillsborough Independent Panel was set up and first met on the 4th of February, at our first meeting, we met with the three family groups. And indeed, it was their questions which helped shape the report and the direction that we took. Even more importantly, it was their dignified determination that gave us all a common resolve to work together in this task. I had prepared a 20-minute statement to give you prior to your questions, but having followed the Prime Minister's statement, much of what he said has covered the ground that I was going to say, and so I don't want to waste your time by repeating what now is already in the public domain. And so I'm very happy now to invite questions from you to myself through our chair today. Peter Sissons will take and field the questions and then direct them accordingly. Thank you.
Well, I've been asked to conduct the order in which people speak. If you want to speak, please put your hand up. I'll come to you when I can, and I'll ask you to state who you are and who you're representing. So who's the first? Blue shirt over there.
Hello, it's Paul Kelso with the Daily Telegraph. Can I ask the Bishop whether, in light of your findings made very clearly here about the failings of the initial inquest, whether you believe it's time for those verdicts to be quashed and new inquests to be opened.
It's a very important question because it raises the issue of the nature of the panel. We are not an inquiry. People have not appeared before us. People have not been questioned. People have not had legal representation. Our job has simply been to oversee the maximum possible disclosure of all the documents and to write a report which adds to public understanding. And therefore our terms of reference don't actually allow us to make any recommendations. The documents, in other words, must speak for themselves.
Next. Judith Moritz.
Judith Moritz, BBC News. I note from your summary that no contemporaneous documents have been discovered by you surrounding the visit the following day after the disaster by the then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Douglas Hurd, Home Secretary at the time, to Hillsborough. I wonder, first of all, whether you could tell us about your efforts to find those documents and why perhaps you feel that they don't exist. And then as a second part of the question, whether you could tell us whether News International submitted any documentation to you as part of this process.
I'll take the second question first and say that News International did provide us with documents. The most substantial question, your first one, I'm going to ask both Professor Scrayton and Christine Gifford if they will address that particular issue.
The important thing about Margaret Thatcher's visit is that there are contemporaneous documents that set the context for the visit, and there are contemporaneous documents that discuss the preparation for the visit. But that reference is directly to any document that might or might not have existed concerning the actual briefing when she arrived and when she left. My view on that is there was probably no such document. In other words, our conclusions about that visit and our conclusions about the issues that arise out of that visit are drawn from a range of documents in preparation for the visit and post-visit. But I don't think, and I expect you would all know this automatically, I don't think that the kind of document people would be looking for in a situation like that, which would be what was told to Margaret Thatcher on that day, that such a document would exist. She would have been told that verbally, and I doubt if a record would have been kept of it.
But it is your assessment, is it, that she would have been told something? I'm asking because really, I suppose, the question is what the height of this potential conspiracy may have been. The finger from your report seems to be pointing most strongly at South Yorkshire Police, the Police Federation, and even the Chief Constable. But I wonder whether the suggestion you're making is that it went beyond that. You do say, in fact, it went beyond it to Parliament.
What we found out on that day, states Bernard Ingham, was that a tanked-up mob basically forced entry into the stadium. That is the comment that he eventually gives to us in terms of what happened. So that briefing is not a briefing on paper, and I doubt if those words would ever have been used directly. But that is the exact point that I would want to make. It was verbal information that was given on arrival. And I think that to project that any further than that, to think that those kind of comments would have been committed to paper would be wrong. And I'm not too sure either about how this unfolds in terms of an organised conspiracy. I would be very wary ever of using that phrase in terms of the work that we have actually unpacked in relation to Hillsborough. Conspiracy would not be, it's a big word, and it's a word that carries a very deep meaning.
Christine, would you like to add anything about the accessing of material?
Only to say that just from my point of view, and I looked at all the material, and as Professor Scrayton said, it isn't just one document. You link in one document with another document and you're putting a jigsaw together, which actually supports a case or doesn't support a case. And it's a very forensic process. From my point of view, there's no evidence that such a document ever existed, that it was, we think, a verbal briefing, that she would have been briefed on her way to Sheffield and while she was there, clearly. But there's no evidence that a document existed or that we haven't been shown it.
There's a question right at the back.
Dan Friedman from LBC 97.3 and Global Radio. Could you tell us the family reaction to Mr Cameron's apology in the Commons earlier?
Actually, I was sitting in the front row and I couldn't see the faces, but I sensed that there was rapt attention, and especially when he referred to the double injustice and spoke unequivocally, apologising, that this was well received by the families.
Peter Marshall.
Peter Marshall from Newsnight. It's back to the point about Margaret Thatcher and the visit to Sheffield. Bernard England was talking about a tact on Mark, and yet from what I've seen of the report, it suggested that Margaret Thatcher had a different view, or viewed the police as being defensive and deceitful. Does there seem to be a mismatch, though, between what a press secretary was saying and what she herself was led to believe?
The defensiveness and deceitfulness comment comes much after. It's not actually relating to that particular moment. It's a reflection that she brings later after the revelations that, in fact, they had been deceitful and defensive. So it's not relating to that actual moment. It's a more broad issue about the way in which the police put their case together in the immediate aftermath, beginning on the morning after the disaster and following through. And the only thing I would want to add on that, which I think is really important, when you actually review the document in full, what you find is that those meetings were recorded. They were not just written up, they were actually recorded. And that demonstrates the extent to which we've been able to access significant documentation from the immediate aftermath.
So the scales fell from their eyes and she realised what was going on?
Well, I think, I'd be the last person to try and second guess what Margaret Thatcher thought, but my feeling is that she realised at that moment, and it was particularly, it was a debate that was going on at the time around the Football Spectators Bill. I think that she was reacting very strongly to the fact that the Taylor inquiry had demonstrated the extent of the deceit. And that is, it's in the context of the Taylor inquiry that she was reflecting on the level and intensity of that deceit.
Would you like to wait for a microphone so everyone can hear you?
Nick Ravenscroft, BBC News. You've very carefully worded in this section on the pathologist reports that 28 people had no obstruction to blood flow, 31 people, their hearts and lungs continued to function. 96 people died here in Liverpool. Interminably, people are going to be asking how many people might have been saved. Now, I know it's a difficult question to answer, but are we talking about a handful, half a dozen, possibly a dozen, maybe 20, maybe 30? Can you give us any reasonably informed ballpark figure about, if they'd made a better fist of it in responding to the emergency, how much that figure of 96 could have been reduced by?
This is very technical information. I'm going to ask Dr. Bill Kirkup if he'll take your question. Bill.
Thank you. 28 people had definite evidence that they didn't have obstruction of the blood flow. 16 people had definite evidence of the heart and lungs continuing to function for a prolonged period after the crush. In total, 41, there is some overlap. 41 people, therefore, had evidence that they had potential to survive after the period of 3:15. What I can't say, because it would take a properly constituted body that the panel isn't, is how many of those could, in actuality, have been saved. But I can say that the potential was of that order of magnitude.
Yes.
Owen Gibson from The Guardian. With reference to some of those meetings that occurred with the Police Federation and others in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, I mean, to what extent do you believe that Peter Wright, the Chief Constable at the time, led a concerted cover-up and an attempt to smear those fans?
It's important to understand that the panel steered clear of making value judgments. What we were anxious to do was simply to assemble all the documentary evidence that is there. Because people are not able to appear before the panel to make representations themselves, the panel therefore can't make those sorts of judgments. And whatever personal and private opinions we might have, the terms of reference of the panel forbid us actually making those public statements.
Yes.
David Conn from The Guardian. Just following up on that point, though, about the police statements, we haven't obviously had time to read the report, but just reading the summary, it is very factual, but nevertheless you're finding it a very deep operation to change statements to make them favourable to the South Yorkshire Police and to delete criticisms of support, to emphasise criticisms of supporters. And the South Yorkshire Police case is obviously that they were removing opinion. But do you find, and I know you have to limit yourselves in terms of value judgments, but are you finding that it went beyond opinion and it was therefore an improper process of amending the statements?
I'll ask Professor Scraton to speak in detail to this, but one of the important aspects of our work is all these documents will now go online. In fact, they go online at 2 o'clock, so that people will be able to examine the documents and to see what has been redacted and be able to form their own judgments as to what was actually taking place. But I'll ask Professor Scraton to speak about what emerged in the exchange of emails and correspondence.
Well, I can actually take both of those questions together. I mean, the importance of the immediate aftermath is that self-taken statements, as they were referred to, and they've been popularly called recollections, were taken for internal purposes by the South Yorkshire Police. And these handwritten recollections were there primarily to service the South Yorkshire Police's attempt to put together its case. And it was a highly defensive case. That isn't our value judgment. That is clear from the actual process. What we have seen that when those that they were reviewed and altered, the argument that was put forward was that they would be reviewed and altered to remove conjecture and opinion. But what the correspondence demonstrates is that anything, quote, unhelpful to the force's case were, quote, altered, deleted or qualified. And those officers, and there were a number who objected to this process, are reported as being helped with that process. What comes out of this, then, is far from the assumption made in Lord Justice Stuart Smith's scrutiny of evidence, where it was considered that there were only a few statements that were reviewed and altered that would have been of significance. We found that 116 out of 164 were amended to remove or alter comments that were directly unfavourable to the South Yorkshire Police.
Right. Let's go right to the back, because I can see yes.
What we're saying, we will leave people to judge whether they consider it improper, but what we can see very clearly, it wasn't about conjecture. It was directly those comments that were unfavourable to the police. And I can come back in a second and discuss that issue around the Chief Constable comment.
Yeah, Andrew Bounds at the Financial Times. There's some material in the document about Norman Bettison, who's now, of course, Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, and his role in the South Yorkshire Police investigation. Now, I don't want to ask you to make a value judgment, but I found it quite difficult to follow what exactly he was doing, and I wondered if you could somebody in the panel could put that succinctly into what his role was in this South Yorkshire Police case, as it were, to defend themselves.
It appears very clearly that in the aftermath, Norman Bettison was not in attendance at the match, and he was one of a team that was put together under what became the Wayne inquiry, the internal South Yorkshire Police inquiry, and some of that team were involved directly in review and alteration, although Norman Bettison has always denied his involvement. But he retained a very active role throughout the whole process, whether it was at the inquest or afterwards. And going back to a point that was raised by Owen a few minutes ago, when the actual process came about, of the Police Federation putting their case forward. Norman Bettison was the person who actually, at one of the Police Federation meetings, showed a film that was clearly concerned with the police position with regard to Hillsborough, and indeed he took that film down to Parliament and showed it again in Parliament. So that process of his involvement is threaded through at a range of levels.
Right. On the aisle there, just in front of... That's it.
Nick Garnett from BBC 5 Live. Who told rank and file police officers to concentrate their investigation on alcohol and the amount of alcohol in the victims and those injured in their bodies and in the subsequent hospital treatment they received?
This took place in the gymnasium. Phil, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, I mean, again, we're into a situation where we're talking about what we would call corridor conversations. But a very important element of this process is on the morning that the truth was published in The Sun. That morning, the Police Federation held a meeting in Sheffield, in a restaurant, actually, during the morning. And at that process, the Police Federation Secretary stated that while the Chief Constable could not state it publicly, he had given the Police Federation a free hand and his support. The Chief Constable later attended that meeting, and when he attended that meeting, he stated very clearly that a defence had to be prepared based on, quote, a rock-solid story, and that the blame should be directed towards, quote, drunken, ticketless individuals. He believed at that meeting that the Taylor inquiry would in fact exonerate the South Yorkshire Police. So you can see the generation of this story is happening in that process immediately after. I want to make one more additional point, and it would be this, that over the days that story emerged, basically the Sunday, the Monday and the Tuesday, and of course it was published first in the London Evening Standard on the Tuesday night, 4 senior police officers approached a news agency, White's news agency in Sheffield, with the story, and it was only when they had the 4th account that they felt they had enough, well, it would be quadrupulation, but triangulation, to actually go with the story. And that is precisely what happened. So you can see it's working at those 2 levels, but it's quite clear from the documents that the Chief Constable made that statement according to the Police Federation minutes of that meeting.
But surely it was happening even earlier than that, because it happened in the gymnasium.
Exactly.
What I'm keen on is to find out how the focus went onto alcohol so quickly.
Let me ask Bill to come in on this.
We know that the decision that blood alcohol levels be taken from all of the deceased at post-mortem was taken by the coroner. The documents show that. We know from the timing that decision must have been taken on the Saturday evening or early on the Sunday morning. We can't pin it down any more closely than that. And the documents show that all of the pathologists were involved in carrying out the coroner's instructions. The documents unfortunately shed no more light on the decision-making around taking alcohol samples from some of the survivors who were taken to hospital.
And all these documents, of course, are now and have been in the public domain for the last 10 minutes, so there's a rich seam there for you to mine. There.
Martin Geisler from ITV News. It's a question for Professor Scraton, I guess. This report backs up what you and the families clearly have been saying for many, many years. Did you discover anything that you didn't expect to find? And if so, to what extent?
I mean, I'm not going to be evasive about this because it's a 400-page report. And I think that a considerable amount of the material that we previously researched and knew about, that was published in Hillsborough the Truth, is borne out by the research here. But the one thing I would say is that there is a whole range of material, particularly the medical evidence, which is absolutely crucial. that is new. That re-evaluation of that evidence, that reanalysis of that evidence is crucial. I think the material I referred to a second ago about the news agency and the story unfolding, that is all about the depth and integrity of the documentation. What is very, very clear here, which is most unusual in any investigation, is that just the sheer volume and density of the material that is there, the way in which we've been able to cross-reference that in doing the research so that we can build a story, a narrative that is absolutely clear and beyond doubt, and then at that same time provide references online to documents that you can read alongside the report. So the analysis and the depth of the analysis is what I think has really hit home for me. And it actually takes the process to another level. And I think my final point would be, I think that was demonstrated by the Prime Minister's assertion in the House of Commons a few minutes ago. It was so powerful that he is clearly beyond doubt. It is clearly for him beyond doubt that the evidence points in the direction that the families for many years have argued.
Yes, wait for the mic. Thank you.
Brian Reeve from the Daily Mirror. Prior to today, the Hillsborough disaster went down as the biggest disaster, sporting disaster in this country's history. Do you think now it's going to go down as the biggest cover-up in the history of this country?
Excuse me. I think that there are other steps that need to be taken before one can make that sort of judgment. Clearly, the documentary evidence shows that what people understood so far was not the whole story. And when you talk about cover-up, it suggests all sorts of other culpabilities. And I think there are necessary steps to take in order to prove culpability. And I think that's where the panel rightly draws back from making that sort of judgment. But I appreciate the question.
Nick, again.
You've made it very clear that it's beyond your terms of reference to make judgments or recommendations. But you have on your panel a very experienced lawyer, a very senior police officer, and a professor who I think is in the Department of Law. And I would be interested to find out whether they would be at all surprised or shocked if criminal prosecutions were to follow some of the new revelations which have come out of today's panel report, whether that be into mistakes which were made on the day or potentially perverting the course of justice in the aftermath.
Well, then I'm delighted to ask Raju and Paul if they'd like to comment on your question.
I think for the reasons you've already adverted to, it really would be improper for me to offer an opinion on what I think. I think what I can say is that there is sufficient new material, sufficient new evidence that cries out for proper consideration by the proper authorities, whose job it will be to decide whether that evidence amounts to sufficient for purposes of a prosecution.
I would totally agree with that, that it's much time has passed since these things actually happened. There's a lot of new material now in the public domain, and it's for those agencies and those bodies that have to make decisions to now consider that in the light of the time that has passed, in the light of public interest, in the light of all the things they have to consider, but those are their considerations. I would neither be surprised nor not surprised after what we've found out in this review.
Could I add a rider to what you've just heard, which is from a layperson's point of view, observing both inquiries and this particular panel process? It seems to me that one of the problems with legal inquiries is that it distances the victims and their families. What has been so positive about this process is because it's not an inquiry, we've been able to engage closely with the families, so they've not felt that distancing which has taken place on other occasions with legal processes. And there may well be, depending upon what the Attorney General says, further legal steps, But I want to say that the panel process has been good in that it has allowed the panel to work closely with the families.
If I might add also, James, everyone here, as I know from my own work, wants to hear new judgments and new opinions from the panel. What judgments have been made are in the report and are backed, each one of them, by a piece of paper which you can access now online, which is now public property. Don't expect the panel to come here and give you a whole lot of new assessments of the situation. We've spent 2.5 years doing that. Peter Marshall again.
Great play has been made over the years about missing CCTV tapes from the control room. Did you get anywhere looking for these missing CCTV tapes?
I'll ask Christine if she'll speak to that, but can I just say that for me, one of the most revealing moments was standing in the police control box and realizing how visible pens 3 and 4 were. There was no need for media technology to see what was happening in those 2 pens. But Christine, in terms of accessing material.
We accessed a great deal of video material, and we did make very stringent inquiries for the CCTV tapes that you mentioned, which apocryphally have been missing for a very, very long time, and we didn't find them. So, but we did do our best to establish that we had, as Phil said, an audit trail of the CCTV that we did have available to us.
But the tapes were missing. I mean, the tapes are missing.
Well, who knows that they're missing, because we never established that they were where they were or that they were truly there in the first place. So it's an apocryphal story about the missing tapes. We never had any evidence that would lead us to believe that they'd been destroyed, but we never found them.
That's a problem, isn't it? You can't know what you haven't got, what you're not given.
Well, you do know what you haven't got to some extent, normally with documentary evidence, because of this forensic piecing together of documents which actually support each other. So you know what you haven't got then. But the situation with the CCTV tapes was slightly different.
I think that if I can just, I think the importance of the question is about the assumed robbery of 2 tapes, you know, and it goes back to various accounts. What I am convinced of is that if those tapes existed, and let's say that they did, whatever was on them would not have helped us any more than the material that we had. In other words, not only the visual evidence, not only the actual evidence of people from the control box, but all the other tapes and all the other material that was there. There are no gaps. What I'm trying to say is there are no gaps in the sequence of events that would suggest that 2 further tapes or 5 further tapes would have given us any more information than we needed to be able to base our findings in the work, or what this adds to public understanding is the phrase we use. Nothing would have provided us more than what we have. That's what I'm trying to say to you.
Down here at the front.
Tony Barrett, The Times. You mentioned earlier that no one came before the committee, before the panel, and just by extension to the question about the tapes, you produced a thorough report that I think has surprised everyone by how extensive it is. Do you think, having been through all the evidence, but with the remit having been only for the documents themselves, how great do you think the scope is for the scrutiny to become wider?
Roger, do you want to comment on that?
I'm not sure I understood that question.
What I mean is that the investigation, as it stands, is reduced only to the documents, but there would be other anecdotal evidence and other information that you wouldn't have. Is there now scope for the investigation to be spread even wider?
There is material there that is crying out for scrutiny. We've already heard that the Attorney General has gone on the record saying he will be giving consideration to the material to decide precisely what kind of scrutiny it will deserve. I have no doubt that the Home Secretary will also be looking at her obligations. And there are many ways to achieve accountability for the purposes of justice. Investigations can be through many modes, and it'll be for all these various government authorities to decide how best.
But without underplaying the work that you've done as a panel, do you feel that this is only part of the story?
Well, can I say that the panel process comes to an end at the end of September? We're staying in place so that we can support the families in accessing and assimilating the material. The website, however, will continue to be serviced so that there will be an editor that can add any new material that is forthcoming. As to scrutiny of that material, then that will depend on subsequent legal processes, the next one being the Attorney General, and beyond that, we can't comment any further.
I will come back to people who've asked questions before, but who hasn't asked one yet? The gentleman there.
Thank you. Martin Beckford from the Daily Telegraph. One of the things that your report has found for the first time is the fact that the ambulance service also doctored statements. And I'm just wondering whether that was, I know you don't want to say conspiracy, whether that was linked to what police were trying to do to build up their own defence or some other reason.
Yeah. The actual explanation that's given, and you'll see this in the report, in their own documentation from the South Yorkshire Metropolitan Ambulance Service, was that variation, there's a wide variation in amendments, and that is in the same kind of justification that's given by the South Yorkshire Police to remove conjecture and so on. But what we have found is that in a number of cases, criticism of the ambulance service, their response was deflected, and clearly the efficiency of their response was emphasised. So what you see there is self-explanatory. It is about it is about putting the service, I would think, into the best light.
And who's not asked a question yet and wants to get in? The gentleman there in the raincoat.
John Sutton, Liverpool Echo. Should members of the families require the panel's assistance beyond September, will members of the panel continue to help them in their journey towards justice?
They would have to do that on an informal rather than a formal basis.
Right, back to The Guardian, yes?
Owen Gibbs from The Guardian again. I mean, you've illustrated quite powerfully through the report and through your earlier work how some of these myths took hold among the wider public. Do you hope and expect that today's statement in the Commons and the report you've published will finally lay those to rest?
I certainly think there are two audiences for today. I said this to the families when I was introducing the report this morning. There is the audience of the bereaved and those who share their loss, and then there is the audience of the wider world. And certainly the Prime Minister seemed to recognise this in his statement and in the exchanges. And I think that the way the report is received will add momentum to its seriousness and indeed influence how the wider world views Hillsborough.
Judith, do you want to come back?
The families say that for 23 years they've never had the truth. Do you now feel that that's changed for them and this is the truth?
You will have to ask the families that. It's not a tried response to your question. What I can tell you is that in the process of the panel's work, on more than one occasion, the families have said to me that this is the first time that they feel they've ever been taken seriously and that anybody has ever really listened to them. And I think whatever may be the deficiencies of the panel's work in terms of making value judgments, its success is that it has taken the families and their questions very seriously.
I think there's a very important point that goes to the heart of what you're asking, Judith, and the question that was asked earlier. I think that in terms of value judgments, that is not our role. But when you have the opportunity to read the report in depth, and there's no precedent for this, what you will see is that value judgments are not necessary. The actual documents speak for themselves. The depth of the documents, the integrity of the research into them speak for themselves. So we don't need to draw on value judgments. to draw conclusions. The conclusions are there. And to go back to the earlier point, which I think is really important, about where does this fit within the kind of overall notion of truth around Hillsborough. I don't think that the panel's work at all was inhibited. In fact, I think it was strengthened by not having a public inquiry status and not bringing people before it, and not 23 years later trying to piece together conjecture and reality and so on. What we have here, 23 years of contemporaneous documents, stage by stage, which has gone through a forensic analysis at all levels. And I think that in that sense, it's a much stronger document than anything I've ever seen in this area of investigative research.
David Conn, again.
Yeah, David Conn, The Guardian. That leads into what I was going to ask you, actually, which was, this has been, as far as I understand it, a unique exercise where there's been this level of disclosure of documents, and there's been an independent panel of experts to be able to go into them and report on them in this way. I mean, there was nervousness here in Liverpool and amongst the families about what you were going to find and how definitive it was going to be. And then I think with the Prime Minister's statement that it is as incontrovertible as it could have been. I know that you're bound by the terms of reference, you're not making value judgments, but I suppose to Professor Scraton and to the Bishop and to anybody else, how do you assess the impact of what you've done? I know in your public statements, the Bishop, you've said you see your role in this, which is very unusual for somebody from the church to be involved with something like this, as far as I understand it. You see it as part of your wider pastoral role to the people of Liverpool, so perhaps you might reflect a little bit on what you see, how you see the job that you've done today and the response it's already had.
Thank you, David. I think one of the special characteristics of our work is that in a moment the families themselves are going to be able to interrogate every single member of the panel. We're going upstairs for a question and answer session, and we have constructed this day very thoughtfully so that the dignity of the families would be protected, so that they would be able to assimilate what we knew was going to be difficult material, and that they would not be shortchanged in any way, so that they wouldn't be exposed to the world without the opportunity of really understanding the material that we were laying before them, which is why, in fact, this press conference will need to come to a close soon so that we can go upstairs and continue the engagement with the families. And you're absolutely right, David, to point out that on this panel, we all bring different expertise. I suppose the expertise I bring is as a pastor and somebody who is committed to a just and fair world. And it seems to me that that lies at the heart of the work that we're doing in the panel, that we are looking for truth and for justice.
Let's take just two more questions.
I'm sorry I keep adding. I think there are 2 points that spring to mind for me in that. I mean, the one thing that is striking is that we are a panel of very different expertise, but we're also different people. And the issue for me that has been so important in the panel's work is the unanimity of the panel, that there is no dissenting voice. And I think the fact that we can all stand over every word that is in this report is something that is important. To go back to the families, and many of the people in the room would know that I've had a long association with many of the families. And when I finished this morning giving the address on the report alongside my colleague, Dr. Kirkup, to see every member of the families standing and applauding the work, to me, was a clear indication that we'd done the right thing. And that, alongside the unequivocal apology and acknowledgement that has been given by the Prime Minister and all others in the House of Commons on behalf of our society, is absolutely crucial to us as a panel.
I think we'd all endorse 100% what Phil has just said. I'm only going to take two more questions. Right at the back, there's a blue shirt who's asked one already. Have you asked one already? Well, I'll come to you next then, and then that must be it.
Dan Freeman from LBC again. Just on a personal level for the 8 of you, I just wondered, how difficult has it been for you to uncover some of the truths that you've discovered with this report?
I'm going to do a free-for-all here and let somebody choose that question if they want. Please, Paul.
I think there are difficulties. There are always difficulties in looking at things that have gone wrong or things that have been done wrong. And that should in no way take away from the fact that many police officers, many ambulance staff, many lawyers tried to do their best at the occasion of Hillsborough. But some got it badly wrong. And that does make it difficult. It makes it difficult in a personal sense. But what makes it really strong then is to think that we're giving a document that can actually help make it better for the future, because these mistakes don't need to happen again. And one of the things that struck me very, very strongly was the lack of acknowledgement of the lessons of the previous years at Hillsborough, the lack of change that had happened at the ground in the years coming up to 1989 that was really known about. There were lots of safety features that could have been improved. That was known about. Nothing had happened. I think that was quite strong for me, and I'm quite glad to have been a member. I'm really glad to have been a member of the panel, but I'm quite glad that this document is now out there, and the supporting documentation for every single fact is there and accessible to the public.
And I'm sorry, I must take just the last one here on the aisle.
Dan Kay, Liverpool Echo. How confident are you that you have received absolutely everything that's there, and that nothing has been held back?
I'll get Christine, please, to answer that, because she oversaw a lot of the accessing material.
The report and the appendix to the report in particular deals with the process that we use to ensure that we undertook this forensic approach to accessing information, and we actually moved from one organisation to another because we realised that organisations that we hadn't originally had in our sites actually might have had some information because of this forensic approach. As far as I'm concerned, we had absolutely all the information made available to us, some of it many times. There's a huge amount of duplication that we have attempted to weed out, and which you'll be able to identify in the master catalogue. And you have to make a decision for yourselves. In the master catalogue, which will be online this afternoon, you'll be able to see all the documents that we considered, whether they were relevant or not, and what we did with them. So the whole audit trail is there for you to make a judgment. I'm absolutely satisfied that we saw absolutely everything that would lead us to being able to draw out from the information the really most important points of adding to public understanding about what happened. And if I can just add one point there, which probably goes back to the last question. The questioner asked what it was like for us. For us, and I know I only speak for myself, but I think I also speak for the panel when I say that, firstly, I consider it to be a privilege to be asked to do this work. But the privilege came from accessing all of the information and finding the truth wherever it led. And that was a prerequisite, I think, for all of us. That the documents told us and will tell you what happened. And there was an understanding on the part of the panel that this was the way that it absolutely had to be.
Phil?
I mean, as a researcher who understands Hillsborough and the history of Hillsborough, my own inclination is very, very clear that there is nothing there that I would have wanted to see or have assumed that we haven't seen. That's why the process has taken so long, the process of access. And it goes back to cross-referencing. If you cross-reference your sources, and many of the people in this room know exactly what I'm talking about, if you cross-reference your sources, then the gaps appear, and then you fill the gaps, and then you look for further work or further material. And in terms of the substance of this report, the 12 chapters and all that we've dealt with, and the questions that the families found that were unanswered, I think we have been able to access all documents that were relevant to those questions and to our own questions. So I'm confident that even if some documents are not there, even if some tapes are not there, whatever, we have sufficient to draw the in-depth conclusions, the analytical conclusions that we have.
James. In conclusion, I'd just like to thank you very much for respecting what the panel insisted upon, which is that the families should receive this information first. I know there have been various requests from the media to have access on an embargoed basis. I know it's been unusual and difficult not to have that in order to file your stories. But I do, all of us on the panel, appreciate your cooperation in this. And you'll understand now that our priority is to go back and be with the families and allow them the same opportunity to interrogate the panel that you yourselves have had. Thank you very much indeed.